Okay, so I know it's been quite a while since I uploaded the poll to find out the topic of this Bleach battle analysis video, but over 10,000 of you guys actually voted on that, which I'm really just amazed by. And of course, your winner was by majority Shinji versus Aizen. I have to be honest, I was kind of surprised by this outcome. I went into the poll thinking that Ichigo versus Gin would win, and it seems like a number of the commenters were also similarly surprised as well, with a number of people voicing their concerns and saying, you know, Shinji versus Aizen is virtually non-existent as a fight. It is incredibly short and over in the blink of an eye. And those criticisms are definitely not unfounded. This fight is, as you will see, very, very short. However, going back through the battle again, in preparation for this video, I actually have a newfound appreciation for it and for what we actually get. In many ways, I'm grateful we get anything at all for this. These two characters, Shinji and Aizen, have such a storied history together. It really lends this battle a uniquely personal feel that Kubo was quite clearly going for, definitely trying to make the most out of the fact that these guys have an actual relationship, which is actually something you can't really say for a lot of characters, and Aizen, which is done on purpose. Aizen tends to see himself as aloof and above your sort of average person, so it's very, very interesting to see him come up against a character who can kind of match him wit for wit. And I actually love that. Going back, I found there was a load to talk about the respective characters involved in this battle, thanks to the personal connection they have. If you look at Bleach as a whole, this isn't really a criticism, but a lot of fights, they don't really involve a personal connection. If you've just got a captain against an espada, a lot of the time, those are fights born out of duty. So when something like this comes along, it is very unique and intriguing. Before we begin, however, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now, as you're in the perfect place of Bleach content like this every single week. And I would really appreciate the support. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up as well. That goes a really long way to helping with the exposure of the video and making sure that as many Bleach fans on YouTube get a chance to see it, just like yourselves. And of course, if you want to take that support from me a little step further, we do now have a Patreon for the channel as well, where you can support me for as little as $1 a month, get early access to videos, and of course a massive thank you goes out to everyone who is a patron so far. I really appreciate it. Right, so looking at the fight then between Shinji and Aizen, and in many ways this fight is a bit of a weird one because of the length of it and because nothing that crazy happens in it. I think it flies under the radar a lot of the time, but it is actually quite a prominent and important fight. This is of course the first time Aizen has really stepped onto the front lines, something that is acknowledged by Tozen as their fight is happening concurrently. The manga lifespan for this fight runs from chapter 383, Too Early to Trust, to 387, Ignited. And a small fun fact, Too Early to Trust is one of my absolute favourite titles in Bleach for a chapter. I don't know why, I just think it's totally badass and it's really, really cool and really helps set that uneasy stage for the fight to come. Of course, this fight is absolutely not 4 chapters long. It is incredibly broken up. And in my personal opinion, if you were to take the disparate parts of this fight and smash them together, you might get 1 chapter's worth of a battle. I do think when you look at the timing of this fight, there is a sense that this is when Kubo was starting to have to speed things up a bit in the Arrancar arc after taking a decent amount of time on the top 3 Espada and the Fraction battles before that as well. It's no coincidence that suddenly a lot of events start overlapping each other. The Yami fight ends just before this fight begins and is never seen again until after Aizen is defeated. Aizen takes on Shinji at exactly the same time as Tozen takes on Komamura and Hisagi, which means certain things are going to get pushed to the wayside a little bit. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm glad that the Komamura fight gets a lot of spotlight because it's one of the best fights in the series as far as I'm concerned, but I can't help thinking I'd have loved to have seen a little bit more from Shinji versus Aizen. The start of this fight is very unique, however, as we are in a pretty dark and desperate situation for the good guys. Aizen himself has just taken out the 3rd Espada Harabel and is now preparing to take on just about everyone by himself. And also, Hiyori has just been cut in half by Gin. Now, that might not sound like a big deal after reading the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, where gore and brutality and the violence of war were all around us, but back in the day, reading this weekly in the HIRAKO arc, which for all intents and purposes had treated the good guys pretty well, seeing Hiyori be cut in half was a massive cliffhanger, and it was like so up in the air as to whether or not she would actually survive. Amazing panels like Shinji holding Hiyori's body while her legs are in the foreground somewhere. Really just awesome stuff all round, and it really helped to ramp up the tension, and I think Kubo knew and understood that, which is why he then has Shinji take on Aizen almost immediately afterwards. And this is a great way to open this fight. I love the determined look on Shinji's face, this look of utter hatred in his eyes. Shinji is a character who will crack wise in almost any situation. He's cool, calm, and collected, and to see him like this really helps to hammer home just how much trouble they are in and how much he despises Aizen as well. And Aizen plays on those feelings. He's like, do you despise me? Well, come and face me then. And just the whole start of this fight is very unlike anything else we ever really get. Now, I feel like Shinji, despite being this kind of jokester, despite being a guy who seems very laid back, he's always treated Aizen quite differently, and I think that's down to a couple of factors. Obviously, their personal history, but the fact that he is very aware of just how dangerous Aizen can be. Now, when Shinji first arrives, he basically immediately goes for Aizen and tries to instantly take his head off, which is, again, quite uncharacteristic. And here and now, Shinji prepares to take Aizen on with a very serious look in his face. And again, another fun fact for you, this panel of Shinji is like one of my absolute favourites in the series. He just looks really cool, very unlike his normal self. The time for joking is not now. Normally he'd be up for a joke, but not this time. Things are getting real here. Aizen, of course, does what he does best and uses his guile to mock Shinji, basically saying, I like the look in your eyes. They look like eyes that have come back to life after 100 years. And it's really cool seeing Shinji sort of like clutch Hiyori's, the top half of her body, in his hands. You get the sense that he is doing everything he can to not just lunge at Aizen, because, of course, doing so is essentially going to be asking to lose. And so Shinji approaches Aizen instead, in a sort of calm and collected manner. What's really fascinating here is that Aizen is the one to openly challenge Shinji, basically saying, if you want to fight me, then you can do. I'll make an exception for you and actually use my blade. Which is another moment I really love, because you just get the sense again that Aizen thinks himself so far above everyone else that he's like, you know what, I'll give you the honour of actually drawing my Zanpakuto against you, which is really cool and just another great character moment. One thing I really like about this scene as well is that although Aizen is so clearly stronger than Shinji, and he knows it, Shinji knows it, you kind of get the sense that Aizen still feels he has something to prove here to his former captain. Aizen is uncharacteristically going out of his way to get Shinji to actually fight him. Now, it is Aizen's game to aggravate people and to mock people and to kind of cause them to act foolishly, but here you do get the sense that Aizen is desperate to prove himself and to actually defeat Shinji in a fight, in a duel. That's why he's like, come here and I'll take you on with my Zanpakuto. That's a really nice moment. You get the feeling as well, maybe, that Shinji perhaps feels some kind of guilt here as well. He has to take on Aizen. There's more than just duty at stake here. Because he was Aizen's former captain over 100 years ago, he maybe feels some responsibility for either not stopping him back then or letting it get this far in the first place. And so they're ready to face each other. And just the whole intro here, I was compelled to talk about it because it really is like nothing else in Bleach, and it really kind of sets the tone for the fight moving forward. Now, I honestly wish that Aizen and Shinji were given more time to talk, because the two of them talk in a way that, again, is very unique for someone dealing with Aizen. Shinji talks back to Aizen like nobody else can, kind of mocking the fact that Aizen doesn't even trust his own men, that there's no trust there between the two of them whatsoever. And I think this is basically Shinji, explaining and revealing that he knows Aizen better than really anyone else could, including his own men. Now, of course, Shinji doesn't really know Aizen, But perhaps, other than maybe Gin, Shinji certainly has the best idea, the best read on Aizen out of everyone else here. I just think it's really refreshing when you have the main villain of this whole series being talked down to, or at the very least being spoken to almost like an equal after he's, essentially revered as a god by the Arrancar for so long. It's great to see Shinji kind of verbally sparring with him and putting him in his place. Shinji says to Hachi, "I need you to look after Hiyori until Ichigo arrives," and then he begins to talk to Aizen. And Aizen kind of mockingly says, "Oh, until Ichigo arrives, you're putting an awful lot of trust and faith in that boy." In my opinion, this is Aizen kind of calling Shinji out, basically saying he's weak, fight your own battles, why are you putting so much trust in that human boy? Shinji retorts with, well, you would never understand. It's pretty standard good guy to villain stuff. You would never understand. This is coming from the guy who won't even trust his own subordinates. Bearing in mind, of course, they've all just witnessed Aizen cut Harabel down. Aizen, however, says that trust is the same as dependency, and that is something that the weak do, and he and his allies have no use for it. However, Shinji has a really nice comeback here, and this is exactly what I mean by seeing someone sparring verbally with Aizen of all characters, basically saying, well, dependency, that's pretty rich coming from someone who drags as many henchmen around with him as you do. But perhaps, maybe you just trick them into following you with your fancy words. Again, just really nice. And you have to understand as well, while this fight is quite short, half the battle is being done with words. That's a lot of the barbs being thrown back and forth is with words. And I actually really love the dialogue here. Aizen rebukes this, however, by basically saying, well, I never told my followers to trust me, simply to come with me. Now, if you ask me, this feels like an obvious half-truth from Aizen, and I think he must be aware of that as well. While he may not have explicitly told the Arrancar to trust him, certainly he must have been aware that they are very dependent on him. Hollows are intrinsically missing something from a part of themselves, and many of them would have certainly looked to Aizen, his order, his rule, to have filled that gap. And Aizen clearly knows that based on the upcoming speech. It's just kind of sad in a way, because clearly the Hollows were used in much the same way as the Shinigami were. Aizen treats everyone like a plaything at the end of the day. The way Aizen cuts Harabel down, he's disposing of her, he has no further use for her, is very telling. The way he doesn't care at all about the Hollows or what becomes of them, despite having taken their home essentially and turning it into his base and posing as almost like not quite a messiah to them, but certainly someone they can follow and be safe with. Only to cast Harabel aside like that is very damning. So, having proclaimed this idea of them not needing dependency and calling it weak, and then having demonstrated on Harabel that Aizen was disappointed in how the Hollows acted anyway, he comments that, unfortunately, none of those Hollows were strong enough to follow through on Aizen's own ideal, kind of reinforcing this idea that he is kind of better off on his own anyway. We're now treated to one of Aizen's best and certainly most famous speeches of all time, as it really gives us quite a unique insight, a glimpse into this man's mind and essentially his motivations and the way he views the people surrounding him. Now, you have to understand, if you weren't reading the series weekly at the time, it was almost a bit of a running joke that not a chapter would go by without some kind of philosophical speech from Aizen. He was philosophical to a fault back here. However, I think this speech is highly effective. It's very sinister in nature, and it really does give you the idea of who Shinji is exactly dealing with. Shinji and Aizen are quite intriguing characters in their own sense. Like I said earlier, they're able to verbally spar with one another, almost as though they are equals. However, it's this speech that I think really tells Shinji exactly what he is up against. Aizen's speech is fairly simple this time around. He says that all beings need to seek someone greater than themselves to follow, and then they will blindly follow that person and give themselves a sense of purpose. To avoid this pressure, the recipients of that faith will then seek someone even greater than themselves to also follow, and this cycle of worship will continue. Eventually you get to the top, and that person will also seek a greater power to follow. This is how all kings are born, and then crucially, that's how all gods are born. This idea of a constant cycle of worship, a hierarchy of worship, if you will. Again, ending the speech in a pretty sinister way, Aizen says to Shinji, "Don't believe in me just yet, Shinji. I'll take my time slowly showing you exactly who the god is that you should put your faith in, and then believing in me comes after that." This speech is great for a number of reasons. It's pretty transparent that Aizen considers himself to be that god at the top of the hypothetical food chain, as it were. And of course, we've seen this played out in real time with the Hollow's dependency on him. He's clearly referencing their worship of him and how he has taken those people and built himself up to be a god that they believe in. And I absolutely love the way Kubo draws Aizen when he says how all gods are born. Again, it's very sinister, very forceful, and it feels like Shinji himself can feel the weight of that proclamation. You have to notice as well that Shinji, who up until this point has been pretty calm, now begins to sweat, which of course is done on purpose by Kubo to show you, the reader, that now Shinji is starting to understand exactly the kind of person he is up against. The stakes are very real, and Aizen firmly believes in what he is talking about. But not only that, Shinji knows it to be true as well. He's seen it, like I said, with the Hollows. These people have seen Aizen as a god. Now, this isn't to say that Shinji immediately thinks he's suddenly going to lose this fight, but it's just more that Shinji knows this speech rings true for some people, and that Aizen became a god to the HIRAKO. But what's truly interesting about this fight, in my opinion, is, as I mentioned, the way Kubo allows both sides to get their barbs in. A lot of the time when Aizen is involved in a battle or a confrontation of any kind, it is depicted as being quite one-sided. I would argue this is one of the few times where it isn't, certainly not this part of the fight anyway. Aizen's just gone off on this spiel about being a god, but Shinji isn't ready to back down. And in my opinion, this is where the coolness of Shinji HIRAKO really pays off. He's able to spar with Aizen on the same kind of level as him. He's really the only person to challenge Aizen in this way, at least up until this point, however, and Kubo makes a real point of drawing their eyes locking at numerous points during this fight, and they appear to be on the same level, and I think artistically this is Kubo trying to show that they are currently, at least anyway, equals. Both of them are speaking, one after the other, their eyes often exactly on the same level. Yeah, and so I think that's definitely done to kind of get rid of this idea that Aizen is above Shinji, for now at least anyway. Now, Kubo really takes his time getting to the point with this fight. We see Aizen slowly drawing his sword, but it is quite cinematic. I like how it's done. I like seeing the explosion in the distance reflected in the metal of the blade. That's really cool. And once again, Shinji goes on the offensive with his words. Shinji admonishes Aizen, calling him a slacker, and it's taken him a very long time to get to this point. And this is really nice because they should have had in the past that kind of student-mentor relationship. Now, obviously, they were both testing one another. They were both in many ways deceiving one another even back then. Shinji, of course, famously having apparently always seen through Aizen since he was in his mama's womb, as Shinji loves to say. Of course, Shinji never quite understood the depth of Aizen's betrayal, the betrayal he didn't see. And of course, it all kind of comes to a head here. Now, neither of them really know what the other one is truly capable of. Although Shinji obviously has a good idea of what Aizen and Kyoka Suigetsu can do, Aizen has no idea about what Shinji can do, and Shinji kind of plays on that fear, and kind of equating Aizen with fear is pretty strange to do, but it works really well here. Aizen is totally silent throughout this next portion, which is very uncharacteristic for him, and Kubo does a great job of wordlessly telling you that Aizen might momentarily be on the back foot. Shinji tries to rattle Aizen by saying that he has no idea what his Zanpakuto is capable of, something that is technically true, and then he activates Sakanade. Now, this was a pretty major moment for us as readers as well. Shinji has been a major character in the Arrancar arc for some time now, the de facto leader of the Vizard faction, and so finally seeing his Shikai was pretty great. But I think that's partly why Kubo draws it out so much, but also because this fight is not the main focus, it's technically the Komamura battle. And so the next part of the fight is essentially the end. And I have a couple of thoughts about this. Before we get into the play-by-play of what happens, do I think that Shinji is kind of underestimating Aizen a little bit here? Yes, I do. Shinji should have a pretty decent understanding of Aizen's capability, and I don't think it's entirely his fault. I do think this fight was rushed to a conclusion, so it could be tied up around the same time as the Komamura battle, which means it doesn't really get to end organically. However, I have to be honest, I do think the way this fight ends makes Shinji look like a bit of a fool, and that's something we'll get into now. In some ways, I think Shinji is kind of letting emotion get the better of himself here, and I do think he's the one doing the underestimating. I think that's quite telling as well. Shinji definitely seems to be really enjoying playing and messing with Aizen. As he activates Sakanade, the sort of strange smell sets in that affects their senses and sends Aizen into the inverted world. It's very telling that Aizen is just not saying a huge amount during this part. And that's because Aizen's a clever guy, you know, he's very, very smart. He doesn't trust Shinji at all. He has no idea what Shinji is capable of. And although Aizen is well aware of his own strength and that he is categorically stronger than Shinji, he knows not to underestimate his former captain, which is something I think Shinji is failing to do here, and he is making a mistake. Now, the ability of Sakanade, the inverted world, is pretty awesome. This has been said a million times before, but it's lovely how it was foreshadowed by Kubo very early on. Shinji floating upside down when he first appears in the manga, and also writing his name backwards in Ichigo's classroom. Lovely little bits of detail there. However, I do think the limitations of this ability become apparent quite fast. And again, that might be down to the rushed nature of the ending of this skirmish. It also doesn't help that Shinji does the typical Vizard thing and narrate the entire of his ability when it activates. He basically tells Aizen exactly what it does, how it's working, and that is a little bit annoying. It's maybe not quite as egregious as Rose's, because perhaps Shinji's is a little more obvious anyway, but it is still very much the Vizard trademark. That being said, Sakanade's power is undeniably cool, and I think Kubo does a good job of portraying it, even if for the most part we just see Shinji as being upside down to us as readers. But that initial panel of the city in the sky, that's really, really nice. You see Aizen kind of ticking it over in his head, trying to deduce exactly what's going on here, but Shinji rushes at him immediately. Aizen, however, correctly deduces that Shinji is actually going to be behind him, not in front of him, because that has been reversed as well. Something that Shinji appears to be surprised by, which is something we'll get into a little bit later on. However, although Aizen has managed to correctly guess that, he hasn't quite bested Sakanade's ability. As he brings in his blade to clash with Shinji's, he's suddenly utterly horrified at the fact that he has been sliced across his arm. Shinji reveals, of course, that Aizen almost got the ability right, but not quite. Yes, they had been reversed that way, but also they are reversed in the way Shinji is attacking him. So it's also a horizontal flip as well. Aizen goes in to block that side, but Shinji's sword is actually coming in from the other way. This is a momentous moment. There's no other way of really saying it. This is obviously a huge win for Shinji. There's a reason that this fairly basic cut takes up over half a page. Up until this point, Kubo had painted Aizen as essentially being untouchable. No one had actually damaged him on screen yet up until this point. The closest we had got was Kisuke slicing off his vice captain's badge in Turn Back the Pendulum, but now someone has actually damaged Aizen in the manga. They have made him bleed, And of course, there is that old saying that if you can make God bleed, people will stop believing in him. And that's quite obviously what this is supposed to be referencing. Shinji has proven that Aizen is essentially just a man like everyone else, and it's no coincidence that from this point on, everything snowballs and Aizen starts actually taking visible damage continuously on screen, leading to his eventual downfall. So I love this moment, and I think that Shinji absolutely deserves to be the one to score this hit. After all, they have so much history together. Aizen is not only the reason he was exiled from Soul Society and nearly killed by the holification, but there's that personal betrayal as well, that he was Aizen's captain, and really Shinji feels responsible in some way for not quite understanding Aizen and for trying his best to keep him at arm's length, but in doing so he opened everyone up to Aizen's machinations. So I think this is a lovely way of bringing that back around again. Back in Turn Back the Pendulum, Aizen spits it in HIRAKO's face. He's like, you didn't trust me, and now you're paying the price for that. And now HIRAKO can kind of say the same thing. And in many ways, that's why I find the ending of this fight to be a disappointing cop-out. If I'm totally honest, that's what it feels like. And we're about to dive into why. So we've had a pretty big moment. Aizen's just taken a hit on his arm, and Shinji says, clearly you didn't notice everything, and realistically, how could you? Literally everything has been flipped, up, down, left, right, forwards, backwards, everything in this fight has been changed around. Even if you understand the ability, it will take you far too long to get used to it. Shinji then says that the stronger somebody is, the more they fight instinctively and on reflex. What he's getting at here is that because Aizen is such a monster, it's going to take him a bit longer to get used to what's actually going on. He has a lot of fighting experience and a lot of strength, and Shinji, I think, is banking on being able to defeat him in time before he works it out. But then, without explanation whatsoever, Aizen simply appears behind Shinji. As Shinji sort of like rushes to Aizen, Aizen is right behind him. And it doesn't seem like Aizen has lifted any kind of illusion or anything. He doesn't even seem to be using Kyoku Suigetsu because he still has the injury on his arm. It's difficult to say then exactly what is going on here. It just seems like Aizen has immediately figured out how to counter Sakanade, which is why I think it's such a cop-out. And it is disappointing in a way. Now, I mentioned earlier on that Kubo allows these two to go one-on-one, and realistically, how long would Shinji actually last against Aizen in a one-on-one scenario? Probably not that long. And of course, we also have to take into account the fact that Aizen did actually successfully realise that Shinji would be behind him, something that Shinji was surprised by. So it's clear that Aizen was catching on, perhaps at a much faster rate than Shinji had anticipated. That being said, it is undeniably disappointing, and it really makes Shinji look quite weak, in my opinion, or at the very least it makes Sakanade look very limited. Aizen slices Shinji across the back. It's a pretty big hit as well, although Shinji himself is basically fine. It is quite a serious looking injury. And Aizen says, oh, so your power is just an optical illusion. Well, that's disappointing. I thought it was interesting, but it's absolutely nothing once someone gets accustomed to it. In reality, it's nothing compared to my ability, which can control all 5 senses. And when put so bluntly like that, it's hard to disagree with him. He's right. Sakanade is a vastly inferior Kyoku Suigetsu, and there's nothing Shinji can do about it. It's a little disappointing then that Aizen completely overcomes Sakanade like that without really doing anything. We know Aizen's incredibly smart, one of the smartest minds in all of Bleach, highly analytical, and as I mentioned earlier, he clearly is not underestimating Shinji. He's trying to work out what's going on. So I do kind of think Shinji is at fault here in some ways for the way this fight plays out. He really wanted that big chance at revenge, and I think he let it slip away from him a little bit, although he should of course take solace in getting that big win and slicing Aizen across the arm. I think I read somewhere that it's not actually Aizen he cuts, but I don't think that's the case at all. I think Aizen is not using illusions in this battle on purpose. to deal with Shinji himself, essentially. And that's literally the end of the fight, because after that, Ichigo arrives, and everything kind of gets a bit interrupted. The Tozen fight ends, Komamura screams at Aizen, and that's it for Aizen versus Shinji. So I do find the ending of the fight to be a tad disappointing, and I feel like it is a little bit of a cop-out. It felt like Kubo really needed to wrap things up because the Komamura and Tozen fight was essentially ending. In fact, it had already ended, really. The previous chapter ends with Hisagi stabbing Tozen, and Kubo still has a ton of stuff to show for the Shinji and Aizen fight, so he was like, I need to end this fight now, so let's just have Aizen immediately appear behind him and apparently already have Sakanade figured out. So in that sense, the ending does feel a little bit empty, and of course I would have absolutely loved to have seen these two fighting for a little bit longer. However, I'm hard-pressed to deny that I don't actually really appreciate what we get prior to the end of the fight. I think the real sparring match here is, of course, with what they say to one another. They're finally given a chance to speak face to face after over 100 years since Aizen's betrayal. And there's just a wonderful sense that they are really feeling each other out. Maybe Shinji is getting a little too cocky. Aizen is probably holding it back a little bit and actually analysing the situation. And I think that makes for a very unique fight with clearly a lot to talk about. But I hope you enjoyed this video, guys. Let me know in the comments below if you enjoyed the very small duel we got between Shinji and Aizen. Would you have liked to have seen a little bit more? Let me know in the comments below, of course. And as always, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now. And until next time, guys, I'll catch you later. I'll see you then.